All right, we're going to go ahead and keep pushing forward. Obviously, we're going to do some review. But before we get into the review, I wanted to kind of refocus our minds on what the purpose is for what we're doing here. There's been several comments made over the last 3 or 4 class periods that I just want to make sure we all are on the same page with where we're headed, why we're doing what we're doing. So we discussed this at the very beginning, and this actually comes straight from Brother Waldron. The objectives, the things that he has in mind, I guess, with this 3-cycle approach. So the one is to etch into the students' minds the basic facts of Bible history. It is a well-established fact that effective repetition is more helpful in learning than one prolonged exposure. Learning done in cycles that are repeated provide for this effective repetition. So, one of the things that I even think about, like with what you're doing right now, maybe you didn't get all of them right, but how many of you could raise your hands and say, you know what, I know more tonight than I did 6 weeks ago, and I know where in the Bible it goes as far as the time periods better than I did 6 weeks ago. So you're getting there. And I mean, this is the second time that I've been through it. There are more things that now I'm remembering that I didn't necessarily remember with the first go around. So we're trying to get to the point where we etch this in our minds. Number 2, provide organization for the knowledge that is gained from Bible study. Through this organization, we hope to provide better access to the knowledge one has. This organization also helps a more nearly permanent retention of knowledge. And so all of us have certain stories that kind of stick with us, but we may remember the story, but maybe not necessarily remember where in the timeline, where in the time periods that it actually occurs. This is helping us with that, to be able to recognize these stories and where they actually fit into the Bible story. And then number 3, see that the Bible records the fulfillment of a plan, God's plan for the ages. This study takes the student through the Bible 3 times, and it does it in such a way that the student has to look at the Bible story as a whole. And of course, we've mentioned that from the beginning. That goes back to this picture. I mean, whenever we think about the story of the Bible, it's the story of Christ. And so that's one of the objectives that he sets forth. There's this book that he put together, and Brother Bob Waldron, he did this. He created this for himself and the congregation that he was a part of, and he kept getting questions asked about, look, can you provide more information so that other congregations can benefit from this? And so he put together a little book just trying to explain his thought process with what he was doing, and he did it in such a way as if you were the teacher or if you were doing your own personal Bible study. And so he mentions also in this book, he says, our goal is to create a directory for every fact in the Bible. Sometimes one may choose to modify these categories. Remember that there is a fine line between having too many of the periods on the one hand and having too few on the other. We could break Bible history into 79 periods, but if you faced the task of learning 79 things in order, or if you informed a class that they now had the task of learning 79 things, they would immediately write the task off as impossible. On the other hand, we could divide the Bible into 2 categories, say the Old and New Testament, but this organization would be too general to do us any good. Before you alter this list, give it at least as much thought as I have. And I've mentioned this, that there are some things that I would like to change, and I may do that at some point. But he's put a lot of thought into the way that he's got this done. And so, he mentions there's obviously other ways to do this. Growing up, at least in high school, I didn't like to read, so they had Cliff's Notes, so you could get the condensed version. This is Bob's notes, okay? So this isn't, anything but Brother Bob Waldron. I'm sure his wife, Sandra, probably played a part in it as well. But this is Bob's notes, kind of like Cliff's Notes. And then he makes just a couple other things. He says, you will see that the list of events in each period is not necessarily exhaustive. Well, we understand that. There's certain things, he lists 2 things, and then some things he lists 20, but it's still not an exhaustive list of all of the things that happened during that particular time period, because if it were, we wouldn't be able to remember all of it. Nobody would, unless you had a photographic memory. And the last thing he says, the idea is to give the class some idea of what is in this period. And so I just want to remind everybody, we as a group, of course, decided to do this. I think it's a good plan. There are some things we could definitely change about it. I have some questions about it. There are some things that are missing. I know that it doesn't even include Psalms and Proverbs. There are things that we know that it doesn't include. But this is the exact same thing that our kids and our grandkids are also studying. And so we're all studying the same thing. And so I've had some people come up to me, and it can get confusing. So I want to make sure that I'm not adding to the confusion by throwing other things in there. I'm trying not to. I'll also say this. There are people in here that I'm sure have a lot better Bible recollection than I do and can do a better job than what I'm doing. And I understand that. I am doing the best that I can. And so let's just keep in mind kind of what the purpose is of what we're doing. And the end goal, ultimately, like I said, you're not going to remember everything. I still don't. But you remember more than you did 6 weeks ago. And if we keep working on this, you're going to keep remembering more and more and more. And we're going to be able to have these discussions with our kids and with our grandkids. So I think that it is a good thing. And then he actually mentions in here, there's a fourth cycle, a lifetime of study. So we're only focused on 3 cycles right now, okay? All right, so 17 time periods. Let's just all say them real quick. All right, we're going to keep working on that. I think that all of you probably know it, but we're not all vocalizing it. So, all right. So I'm not going to make you do it backwards tonight because I want to make sure we get through with what we've got. So we've gone through the first 6 time periods, the second cycle now several times. So let's just go through it really quick, and then we'll get to cycle 7 where your quiz started, and we'll slow down just a little bit. I want to make sure that I would like to get through all of cycle 2 at least once, maybe tonight. All right, so what's the events that we remember before the flood? All right, what chapter is the generations? All right, Genesis chapter 5. All right, what's the events from the flood?
Flood south, to eat different food, all capital punishment, covenant, curse on Canaan, generations.
All right. Anybody remember what chapter all of this takes place, to meat given for food, law? Where? Yep, Genesis chapter 9. Obviously, you're not... See, but we're already prepared now. When we start cycle 3, you're already going to know like the first 4 time periods. All right, scattering of the people, what are the events?
Tower of Babel.
All right, what chapter is that? Genesis chapter 11. All right, patriarchs? All right, and where does that take us through in the Bible? Which is what? Genesis chapter 50. All right, so the Exodus, what are the events in the Exodus?
Israel. Birth, raised their daughter, rejected by people, flee from the wilderness, burning bush, plagues, across the Red Sea, trip to Mount Sinai, trip to Jacob, sending the spies,
All right. And wandering in the wilderness? All right. So now picking up with your quiz, Bonnie had asked me before, is it just the primary points or the secondary points? Well, it's kind of a mix, but the 7, it was mostly the primary points. Why you give me the side eye? All right. So obviously we got 3 campaigns. So what was the first one? Central. Southern. Northern. All right, so I think did I give you that one? Yeah. So what's the
Georgia.
Yeah. So we got a couple of Joshua's speeches there. And then they renew their covenant. I think that it's interesting. One of the things that Brother Waldron actually mentions in the book in regards to this, he says there's so much information in the next few periods. I do not try to list all the events, just get in mind who and what these periods are about. And then when we get into the next few, even talking about the prophets, he mentions that, he likes to mention them, but at this stage, his expectation is not even that you remember all of the prophets. You're just kind of starting that process. And so again, if you didn't get everything and all of the prophets, that's fine. Again, it's just this slow progression where we are going to continue to review. And so just kind of, again, let you know kind of what his thought process is. He's not expecting even at this point that you just remember everything. All right, after the invasion and conquest, we've got the judges. Who are the judges again? All right, so I think I only had like a few blanks on that one. Yeah, so how did everybody do on the one with the judges? Got all them, Miss Shirley? Yes. What, Sam? You didn't get all of them? Hey, man, that's perfectly fine. Next, just keep working toward it. Next time you will. All right, so after the judges, what? All right, so this one was kind of funny because 2 or 3 weeks ago, Wyatt was just messing with Zoe. Actually, it may have been longer than that. I said, so tell me the second cycle for the United Kingdom. And, of course, Zoe was like, I don't know. This is pretty easy. So all of the stories that deal with Saul, David, and Solomon obviously take place with the United Kingdom. So what took us from the United Kingdom to the divided kingdom? Yeah. Who was the son? All right. You didn't get all the prophets? All right, so we divide up into 2 kingdoms, and what are the locations of the 2 kingdoms, and what are their names? All right, so we got Israel to the north. We got Judah to the south. And Miss Shirley, you said, how long did it last? All right, so 200 years until Israel is taken away into captivity. And so, obviously, these are the big things, remembering that when it split, you've got Israel to the north, and then you've got Judah to the south. And it lasted about 200 years. So who are the prophets that we remember from the divided kingdom? All right, Obadiah. Hey, 2's better than none, right? How did everybody do on the prophets for the divided kingdom? Not so good? I could not tell you. This is just the order he gave them in.
That's the only reasonable explanation, because otherwise those first 4 should be in Bible order, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
That's how I wrote it, was in Bible order, because that's how I was trying to.
Yeah. See, and that's. I mean, you got things that are going to help you remember, and use those things to help you remember. So after the divided kingdom, how do we get to the next one? All right, and who's the prophet that is in both of them? All right, so Isaiah is continuing to prophesy into Judah alone. All right, so with Judah alone, who were the kings that we remember? All right, so Manasseh, Josiah. Who was before Manasseh? All right, so we've got Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. And Manasseh, he was probably the best king of all of them, wasn't he? Does anybody remember what took place during the reign of Josiah? They did the little spring cleaning. Actually, I don't know if it was during spring, but they was doing some cleaning, and what did they find? They found the law. All right, so yeah, he was obviously making some reforms after that. So we've got these kings. These are not all of the kings during this time period, but these are the main kings that we remember. And who are the prophets? All right, so Isaiah, I don't know why I don't have that listed there. Obviously, Isaiah is there. All right, so we go from Judah alone into the captivity. Does anybody remember time-wise, like about the time that this was happening, that they went into captivity? 605. All right, so it's around 605, 606, and then how long were they in captivity? All right, 70 years. So with the captivity, there are a couple of prophets that we remember. All right, everybody got that, didn't they? Everybody remember those? All right, so one of the things that we'll talk about, and we just briefly mentioned it last week, as far as after the return with the years of silence and all of the different kingdoms. What's relatable between all of those kingdoms that are discussed in this time period? So all of the kingdoms that we discussed with the years of silence, from one kingdom to the next to the next. All right, so yeah, we're gonna let Todd give us an overview of Daniel's chapter 7 and 8, and obviously it lists all of these with that prophecy of the statue. So from the captivity, we go to the return. And so one of the things that this is just helps me remember, I always remember 605, 606, and so then I think 70 years, and that gets us to the return from captivity, which would be what time? 536. So 536, and we think of it typically in three different returns, with the first one being who? Who? Zerubbabel. You just got to remember how many bubs are in there. Zerubbabel. All right, so he, along with Jeshua the high priest, so they come back, and his focus was in building the what?
The temple.
All right, so his focus is in building the temple. And again, this is around 536, and you've got Haggai and Zechariah that are prophesying during this time. And in between the first return and the second return, we have the book of Esther. So it fits in this time period. Who are some of the main characters we remember from Esther? Mordecai, Haman. And again, these are Bible characters that we know pretty well, so you can just relate that to this is during the return from captivity. All of the story there of Esther we can remember and put in our box for the return from captivity. So the second return, who's the one that is with the second return? All right, we've got Ezra, and he's trying to purify the worship. And then the third one, Nehemiah, and his focus was on rebuilding the wall. And so who's the last prophet then that we read about? All right, so we've got Malachi. And we've talked about this at the very beginning, but what really brings us, go ahead and open your Bibles up to Malachi. What brings us to the years of silence? Like, what do you think the reason for that was? the state of the people?
They were disobedient. They failed to keep God's commands.
Very bored with
Yeah, their hearts.
worshiping.
Yeah. So one of the things that, again, this is all one that just kind of sticks with me, but in Amos 8:11, and we've referred to this in the beginning, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of the Lord. And in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 17, I think that this is probably gives us a good grasp of kind of what's going on. It says, you have wearied the Lord with your words, yet you say, how have we wearied him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or, where is the God of justice? So he's prophesied that there's going to be this famine of God speaking, and it is during this time that we have the rise and the fall of multiple kingdoms. Again, this is spoken of in Daniel chapter 7, and I think it's primarily Daniel chapter 7, also in chapter 8. For sure in Daniel chapter 7. And so if you remember the vision that Daniel had, it will help you kind of remember the fall and the rise of the kingdoms that we have during the years of silence. So whenever we have the return, what's the kind of the reigning power? What did you say?
Persia.
All right, so you've got Persia, and so then after the fall of the Persian Empire, we have the rise of the Grecian Empire, and then during this time period, what happens to the Grecian Empire? So it splits, and we end up with, should have had a map, but you've got an area kind of to the north and east of where the Jews are, and then to the south, obviously, with Egypt, so they're kind of caught in the middle there, and it's during this time period that we have also the Maccabean revolt, which there's a lot of history that you can read of during this time period with the Maccabees. And then during Jesus' time, we often hear Jesus talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's during this time period as well, during this years of silence, that they actually develop. And then who is the power that comes into be before Jesus actually comes on the scene?
Rome.
All right, so we've got Rome comes to power. And who is king when Jesus comes onto the scene? All right, so we've got Herod. So what ends the years of silence? Okay, so the coming of the birth of Christ, but what was the actual ending? Like, what was the event that God is no longer silent? God has spoken.
Father was someone spoke.
All right, Zacharias, who did the speaking? Gabriel. So the angel Gabriel comes to Zacharias, and that ends the years of silence, and he tells of the coming of John. And what was John's purpose? To prepare the way. He was going to be the forerunner. And actually over in Malachi again, there's a couple of prophecies that Malachi gives. So one is in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. And then also in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5, he says, behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And then one of the things that Jesus actually says over in Matthew chapter 11, in Matthew 11 verses 13 and 14, it says, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come. So John comes as the forerunner, preparing the way for Christ. And one of the things that, this is another Brother Waldron approach, but he's broken down the life of Christ into 17 periods. And so The first one being the years of preparation. So he's preparing for his ministry in the years of preparation. And then, obviously, if he starts his ministry, it's going to be the beginning of his ministry. And then where does his ministry kind of take place after the beginning? So it's in Galilee. So we've got the great Galilean ministry. And after this, he's got it as the periods of retirement. And then after that, his ministry is going to come to a close. We've got the close of his ministry. And then he breaks it down into the last week of the life of Christ. And then after his resurrection, the resurrection days. So all of the events that take place after his resurrection. So these are the 7 periods that he's got broken down to help us remember the life of Christ. And I think that kind of makes sense. And so where do we find this in the Scriptures? All right, the Gospels. See, you already got cycle 3 for this one. All right, so what time period do we have after the life of Christ then? All right, so the early church. So we've got the Gospels that are telling us about the life of Christ. And where do we find the time period of the early church found in Scriptures? All right, so how long of a time period does anybody know the book of Acts runs? So it's about 30 years. And so you can break it down into the first 12 chapters, chapters 1 through 12. That takes about 15 years. And we have these stories of conversions, different things that take place during the early church with the persecution that happens and what ends up happening, the persecution where they're trying to really squash the spread of the gospel. People spread out and they just keep their mouths quiet. No, they start preaching the word. And so the word continues to spread. And then Acts chapters 13 and 18, who's the primary character? So Paul's the primary character, not that he had not been introduced before then, but we obviously know about the missionary journeys that Paul takes. And so these are all, again, found in the stories in Acts. Again, covers about 30 years. And the first half of that is Acts 1 through 12, and then Acts 13 through 28 is the last part of that. And then we end up with, what's the final one? All right, so were all of the letters written after this time period here, this 30 years? There's a lot of letters that are actually written during this time period. But again, when you're thinking of it of trying to categorize everything into its own time period, he's broken things up into where all of the rest of the scriptures are going to be into the letters of the Christians. So obviously all of the epistles, all of the letters that we have, and then Revelation. Does anybody remember which letters were actually written during the time of the early church there in Acts? Galatians,
Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Romans. There's 2 more.
1st and 2nd Corinthians.
1st and 2nd Corinthians. So those actually you have written during that time period that we have of the early church. All right, we've made it all the way through with the second cycle. So again, we're going to continue to review. And I think that we only have 4 weeks left because of the gospel meeting. So my mindset right now is to try to focus on the bigger chunks of Scripture that go with the time periods, not necessarily all the individual stories just yet. And so when we run through it the first time, we're going to focus like on when we go through the first 4 time periods, or the first one before the flood, Genesis chapter 1 through 5. We're not going to worry about, this goes with chapter 2, this goes with chapter 3. So Genesis chapter 1 through 5, when we talk about the flood, the time period, chapters 6 through 10, we're going to focus on that, go through all of it, and then with the time that we have left, we'll back up and try to get some of the smaller chunks, because I think that's really what's important, is to make sure that we know with the time periods where in the scriptures they actually fall. Thanks, everybody.